The diplomatic meeting was supposed to be peaceful. Captain Sarah Chen stood in the pristine white chamber aboard the Galactic Council's neutral station, watching as alien representatives from 12 different species arranged themselves around the circular table. The air recyclers hummed quietly, mixing oxygen with various atmospheric requirements for the diverse gathering. Commander Zek Thol of the Hegemony dominated one side of the table. His reptilian form stretched nearly 8 feet tall, covered in dark green scales that gleamed under the artificial lighting. 4 arms gestured as he spoke, each movement precise and threatening. His species had conquered 17 star systems in the past decade, and their military might was legendary across the galaxy. Humans, Zek Thol hissed, his translator converting his words into perfect English. Your species' expansion into the outer rim sectors must cease immediately. The Hegemony has claimed those worlds for strategic purposes. Sarah remained calm, her hands folded behind her back in a relaxed military stance. She wore the simple blue uniform of the Terran Federation. No weapons visible on her person. The other alien delegates watched nervously, knowing that this moment could determine whether peace continued or war erupted across the galaxy. Commander Zek Thul, Sarah replied evenly. Those worlds were uninhabited when our colonies arrived. We followed all Galactic Council protocols for planetary settlement. Our people have been living there peacefully for 3 years now. The Hegemony commander's 4 eyes narrowed to slits. Around the table, other species representatives shifted uncomfortably. The insectoid Kullik delegate's antennae twitched with anxiety, while the gaseous Vorthak representative's containment suit flickered with nervous energy patterns. Peaceful? Zek Thol's voice rose to a roar that made several smaller delegates flinch. Your species knows nothing of peace. We have studied your history, human. Your wars, your violence, your endless conflicts. You are a plague that spreads destruction wherever you go. Sarah's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her dark eyes. Our history includes many things, Commander. Yes, we've had conflicts, but we've also learned from them. Learned? Zek Thol laughed, a sound like grinding metal. You learned to hide your violent nature behind diplomatic words, but we see through your deception. The Hegemony will not allow your expansion to continue. The crystalline Shard-High delegate spoke up, their voice like singing glass. Perhaps we can reach a compromise. The Council exists to prevent conflicts like this. No compromise, Zek Thol snarled. The humans will withdraw from all disputed territories or they will face the consequences. Sarah tilted her head slightly. What consequences might those be, Commander? The full military might of the Hegemony, he replied, standing to his impressive height. Our battle fleets are already positioned at the edge of your claimed systems. One word from me, and they will sweep away your pathetic colonies like dust in a solar wind. The tension in the room became suffocating. Several delegates began backing toward the exits, their survival instincts overriding diplomatic protocol. The Hegemony had never lost a military engagement. Their technology was advanced, their warriors trained from birth for combat, their fleet sizes dwarfing most other civilizations combined. I see, Sarah said quietly. And if we refuse to abandon our homes? Then you will learn why 100 species bow before the Hegemony's might, Zek Thol declared. Your Federation has perhaps 20 battlecruisers. We command over 3,000. Your weapons are primitive plasma charges and kinetic projectiles. We wield gravitational disruptors and temporal field generators. Sarah nodded slowly as if considering his words carefully. Impressive technological advantages, Commander. I can see why you're confident. Confidence born of superiority, he confirmed. Your species achieved spaceflight barely 2 centuries ago. We have ruled the stars for over 10,000 years. This is not a battle you can win, human. The other delegates watched in fascination and horror as the 2 representatives faced each other across the table. Many had expected the human to back down immediately when faced with such overwhelming odds. The Terran Federation was young, small, and technologically inferior by galactic standards. You know, Commander, Sarah said conversationally, there's something I've been curious about. In all your research into human history, did you study our earliest conflicts? Zek Thol's head tilted, confused by the apparent change of subject. Your primitive wars are irrelevant to current circumstances. Perhaps, Sarah agreed, but I find them fascinating. Take the American Revolutionary War, for example. A small group of colonists decided they didn't want to be ruled by a superior military power anymore. Ancient history, Zek Thol dismissed. What relevance does this have? Well, Sarah continued, her voice remaining perfectly calm, the British Empire at that time had the most powerful military in the world. Professional soldiers, advanced weapons, the largest navy ever assembled. The American colonists had farmers with hunting rifles and a dream of independence. Several delegates leaned forward, intrigued despite the tension. The hegemony commander's eyes narrowed further. The British were so confident in their superiority that they barely took the colonial resistance seriously at first, Sarah explained. After all, how could farmers defeat the greatest military machine in human history? Your point, human? Zekthul demanded impatiently. My point is that sometimes the side with superior technology forgets that warfare isn't just about having the biggest weapons, Sarah replied. It's about understanding what you're truly fighting for and what you're willing to sacrifice to achieve it. Zekthul slammed one of his 4 fists on the table, making the entire surface vibrate. Enough philosophy. Your colonies will be evacuated within 1 solar rotation, or we will remove them by force. Do you understand? Sarah met his gaze steadily. I understand perfectly, Commander. You're threatening to attack civilian settlements because you believe your superior numbers and technology guarantee victory. They do guarantee victory, he snarled. Perhaps, Sarah said again, but I should probably mention something about those colonists I was discussing. What about them? Zekthul asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really care. Sarah's smile was small and cold. They won. The silence that followed was deafening. Commander Zekthul stared at the human representative, trying to process the implications of her words. Around the table, alien delegates began to realize that perhaps they had underestimated the young species from Sol System. Impossible, Zekthul whispered. No inferior force can defeat superior technology in numbers. Tell that to the British Empire, Sarah replied quietly. They learned the hard way that sometimes the impossible becomes inevitable when you underestimate the human spirit. The hegemony fleet arrived at the edge of the Kepler 442 system exactly 24 hours later, just as Commander Zekthul had promised. 3,000 warships emerged from hyperspace in perfect formation, their dark hulls gleaming like hungry predators against the starfield. Each vessel bristled with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could deflect entire asteroid fields. Admiral Vexhan commanded the invasion force from his flagship, the Eternal Dominion. The massive dreadnought stretched over 5 kilometers in length, its gravitational disruptors capable of tearing enemy ships apart at the molecular level. Around him, his bridge crew moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for what they assumed would be a routine planetary pacification. Scan the system, Vexhan ordered, his voice carrying the authority of countless military victories. Locate all human installations and defensive positions. The sensor operator, a younger hegemony warrior with bright yellow markings on his scales, bent over his console. Admiral, I'm detecting 17 human colonies across 4 worlds. Total population approximately 12 million. Also registering. This is strange. Report, Vexhan commanded sharply. Sir, I'm only detecting 12 human vessels in the entire system. All appear to be civilian transports or light patrol craft. No battleships, no heavy cruisers, no defensive platforms. Vexhan's 4 eyes narrowed in suspicion. 12 ships? Are you certain the sensors are functioning correctly? Triple-checked, sir. Perhaps the humans evacuated their military assets when they learned of our approach. Cowards, sneered the tactical officer. They heard of our coming and fled like prey animals. But Admiral Vexhan wasn't convinced. He had studied human military doctrine extensively, and retreat without resistance seemed inconsistent with their historical patterns. During the brief border skirmishes with the Zephyrian Collective 5 years earlier, human ships had fought with desperate courage even when outnumbered 50 to 1. Open a communication channel to the largest human settlement, he ordered. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the interior of what appeared to be a simple colonial administration building. A middle-aged human woman sat behind a basic metal desk, her expression calm despite facing the largest invasion fleet in galactic history. I am Admiral Vexhan of the Hegemony First Fleet, he announced formally. You are Governor Martinez of the Kepler 442 Colonial Administration. That's correct, she replied simply. What can I do for you, Admiral? Vexhan was taken aback by her casual tone. Most species representatives trembled when facing hegemony military might. You can begin immediate evacuation procedures for all human settlements in this system. You have 6 hours to comply before we commence bombardment operations. Governor Martinez leaned back in her chair, seemingly unconcerned. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Admiral. These are our homes. Our children were born here, our families are buried here. We're not leaving. Then you condemn them all to death, Vexhan stated coldly. Your 12 patrol craft cannot stand against 3,000 hegemony warships. 12? Martinez looked confused for a moment, then smiled. Oh, you mean our regular patrol fleet? No, Admiral, those ships aren't here to fight you. Then where is your military? Vexhan demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Our military? Martinez's smile widened. They're right here, Admiral. Every single one of them. Before Vexhan could respond, his sensor operator suddenly cried out in alarm. Admiral! New contacts. Massive sensor ghost just resolved into, Dear ancestors, preserve us. The main tactical display exploded into activity, where empty space had existed moments before. Over 800 human vessels now appeared in perfect attack formation. But these weren't the crude, bulky ships the hegemony had encountered in previous skirmishes. These vessels were sleek, predatory, and completely unknown to hegemony intelligence. How is this possible? Vexhan roared. Where did they come from? They must have been using some kind of advanced stealth technology, his tactical officer reported, his voice shaking. But sir, I'm reading their energy signatures. These ships, they're not using plasma or kinetic weapons. Then what are they armed with? Vexhan asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Unknown energy signatures, sir. Unlike anything in our databases. On the communication screen, Governor Martinez was still smiling. I should probably mention, Admiral, that while you were making your dramatic entrance, our military engineers were having a very interesting conversation with some old friends. What friends? Vexhan demanded suspiciously. The Prometheus Institute, Martinez replied casually. They're a research group that specializes in historical weapons technology. Fascinating work, really. They've been studying ancient human warfare techniques and wondering how they might apply to modern conflicts. Vexhan felt a chill run down his spine. Ancient weapons? Your species abandoned primitive projectile weapons centuries ago. Oh, we did, Martinez agreed cheerfully. But the Institute asked a very interesting question. What if we hadn't? What if we had continued developing those old technologies alongside our modern ones? What if we had combined gunpowder chemistry with fusion physics? The tactical display updated again, showing the human fleet moving into attack positions with fluid precision. Their ships moved unlike anything the hegemony had ever encountered, flowing through space like schools of predatory fish. Impossible, Vexhan whispered. Kinetic weapons are obsolete. Energy shields deflect projectiles easily. Usually, yes, Martinez nodded. But the Institute discovered something interesting about kinetic weapons. When you accelerate them to 98% of light speed and coat them with exotic matter. Turns out they don't really care about your shields anymore. The sensor operator's voice cracked with fear. Admiral, the human vessels are charging weapons. Energy signatures are... By the void, sir, I've never seen anything like this. All ships, battle stations, Vexhan commanded, his earlier confidence evaporating. Raise shields, charge gravitational disruptors, prepare for combat. 3,000 hegemony warships wheeled into battle formation, their massive hulks bristling with the most advanced weapons technology in the galaxy. Gravitational fields bent space around their hulls, temporal shields flickered into existence, and reality itself seemed to twist around their quantum disruptors. But the human ships just kept coming, accelerating impossibly fast on drives that defied conventional physics. They moved like bullets fired from the guns of angry gods, and every sensor reading suggested they carried weapons that shouldn't exist. Governor Martinez, Vexhan said quietly, his voice no longer carrying its earlier arrogance. What exactly are you planning to do? Martinez's smile never wavered. We're going to teach you the same lesson the British learned at Lexington and Concord, Admiral. Sometimes it doesn't matter how big your army is or how advanced your weapons are. Sometimes all that matters is that you picked a fight with people who refuse to lose. The human fleet completed their attack formation, 800 ships facing 3,000. The odds still heavily favored the hegemony, but somehow Admiral Vexhan no longer felt confident about the outcome. Fire, he commanded desperately. The space between the fleets erupted in violence as the largest space battle in galactic history began, but as the first exchange of fire lit up the void, Vexhun realized with growing horror that Governor Martinez had been telling the truth. The old ways were about to become very new again. The first volley from the hegemony fleet lit up space like a newborn star. 3,000 warships unleashed their gravitational disruptors simultaneously, creating tears in reality itself that should have shredded the human formation instantly. Temporal distortion fields rippled outward, designed to age enemy vessels into dust within seconds. Quantum disintegrators fired beams of pure entropy that could unmake matter at the subatomic level. Admiral Vexhun watched the devastating display of firepower with grim satisfaction. No fleet in galactic history had ever survived such an opening barrage. The humans might have some new technology, but they were still vastly outnumbered and facing weapons that had conquered 100 worlds. Direct hits on multiple targets, his tactical officer reported with fierce pride. Gravitational distortions are tearing through their formation. But as the energy discharges faded and the sensors cleared, Vexhun felt his confidence crumble. The human ships were still there, all 800 of them, completely intact and accelerating even faster toward his fleet. Impossible, he breathed. How are their shields withstanding gravitational disruption? Sir, the sensor operator's voice was barely a whisper. I don't think they're using conventional shields at all. On the tactical display, the human vessels appeared surrounded by a strange shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But as Vexhun studied the readings more carefully, he realized it wasn't defensive technology he was looking at. Those aren't shields, he said slowly. They're moving too fast for our targeting systems to lock onto them properly. They're not defending against our weapons. They're just avoiding them entirely. The human fleet had somehow accelerated to velocities that should have been impossible for ships of their size. They moved through space like bullets, their courses changing in ways that violated everything the hegemony knew about physics and inertia. Return fire. All batteries, continuous bombardment, Vexhun commanded desperately. The hegemony fleet erupted again, this time maintaining sustained fire instead of coordinated volleys. Space became a storm of destructive energy as 3,000 ships poured their weapons into the advancing human formation. But hitting targets moving at near relativistic speeds proved nearly impossible, even with predictive targeting computers. Meanwhile, the human ships reached optimal firing range. Unknown energy signatures spiking, the sensor operator screamed, "They're about to fire!" What happened next would be studied in military academies across the galaxy for centuries to come. The human ships didn't fire energy beams or launch missiles. Instead, they released what appeared to be simple metal projectiles, no larger than an ancient artillery shell. But these projectiles moved at 98% of light speed. The first hegemony cruiser to be hit simply ceased to exist. One moment it was a kilometer-long warship, bristling with weapons and shields. The next moment there was an expanding cloud of superheated plasma where the ship had been. The kinetic energy released by the impact exceeded the output of a small star. What in the void was that? Vexhun roared, staring in shock at the tactical display. More projectiles lanced out from the human fleet, each one a needle of accelerated metal moving faster than anything should be able to move. Where they struck hegemony vessels, the results were catastrophic. Shields designed to stop energy weapons and deflect conventional missiles might as well have been made of paper. Sir, the projectiles are penetrating our gravitational shielding like it doesn't exist, the tactical officer reported in panic. Our defensive systems can't even detect them until impact. A proximity alarm screamed as one of the relativistic projectiles passed close enough to the flagship to register on short-range sensors. For a brief instant, Vexhun saw it on the screen, a simple cylinder of metal, barely 2 meters long, moving so fast that space-time itself warped around it. How are they accelerating solid matter to those velocities? He demanded. Unknown, sir. The energy requirements should be impossible for ships that size. But Vexhun was beginning to understand. The humans hadn't just developed new weapons. They had developed an entirely new approach to warfare. While every other species in the galaxy had moved toward increasingly exotic energy-based weapons, the humans had gone back to the basics and perfected them beyond imagination. Evasive maneuvers, he commanded. All ships scatter formation. The hegemony fleet began to break apart, individual ships peeling away from the main formation in desperate attempts to avoid the human projectiles. But their massive vessels were designed for sustained bombardment, not high-speed maneuvering. They moved like elephants trying to dodge hummingbirds. The human ships, meanwhile, demonstrated maneuverability that defied physics. They changed direction at speeds that should have turned their crews into paste, following complex attack patterns that kept them in optimal firing positions while avoiding return fire. "Sir, we've lost 73 ships in the first exchange," the tactical officer reported, his voice cracking with disbelief. "The humans haven't lost a single vessel." Vexhan stared at the tactical display in growing horror. His massive fleet advantage was evaporating with each passing minute. The humans weren't just fighting differently, they were fighting better. "Open a channel to the human fleet," he commanded quietly. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the bridge of what appeared to be the human flagship. A woman in a simple military uniform looked back at him, her expression calm and professional. She was young for a fleet commander, perhaps 40 standard years, with short dark hair and eyes that seemed far older than her face. "Admiral Vexhan," she said formally. "I'm Admiral Lisa Park, commanding the Terran Federation's Second Fleet. Did you want to discuss surrender terms?" "Surrender?" Vexhan sputtered. "We still outnumber you 3-1. Admiral Park nodded politely. "Yes, you do. But you've lost over 200 ships in the past 10 minutes and we haven't lost any. At this rate, your numerical advantage will disappear in approximately 43 minutes. Vexhan looked at his tactical display and realized she was right. The human weapons were devastating his fleet while their impossible maneuverability kept them untouchable. His ships couldn't hit targets moving that fast, and they couldn't survive hits from projectiles moving that fast. "What are those weapons?" he asked, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Railguns," Admiral Park replied simply. "Very, very big railguns. Impossible. The energy requirements to accelerate solid matter to those velocities would require the output of entire star systems." Admiral Park smiled slightly. "You're thinking like someone who builds weapons to destroy. We build weapons to protect. When you're defending your home, your children, your future, you find ways to make the impossible work." Another wave of relativistic projectiles lanced out from the human fleet, and another dozen hegemony ships vanished in flashes of plasma. Vexhan watched his powerful armada being systematically dismantled by weapons that any military engineer would have dismissed as obsolete. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No, Admiral," Park replied quietly. "This is human." Admiral Vexhan watched his tactical display with growing desperation as more hegemony vessels vanished under the relentless human assault. The proud First Fleet, conqueror of 17 star systems, was being methodically destroyed by weapons that shouldn't exist and tactics that defied conventional military doctrine. "Sir, the Dreadnought Squadron is requesting permission to engage at close range," his tactical officer reported. "Admiral Korth believes his heavy armor can withstand the human projectiles long enough to bring our gravitational disruptors to bear." Vexhan considered the proposal. The Dreadnoughts were the largest ships in the hegemony fleet, each one a mobile fortress with armor plating meters thick and shields powerful enough to deflect small asteroids. If anything could survive the human weapons, it would be those massive warships. Granted, he decided. Order Admiral Korth to advance with all dreadnoughts, close to minimum range, and engage with full firepower. 12 massive dreadnoughts broke away from the main fleet formation, their hulls gleaming like metallic mountains against the star field. Each ship stretched over 4 kilometers in length and massed more than some small moons. They accelerated toward the human fleet with ponderous determination, their heavy armor and redundant systems making them nearly indestructible by conventional standards. Admiral Park watched the dreadnought advance from her flagship's bridge with professional interest. Her tactical officer, a young lieutenant named Rodriguez, looked concerned as he studied the sensor readings. "Admiral, those ships are massive," Rodriguez reported. "Their armor plating is reading as some kind of exotic matter composite. Our standard projectiles might not penetrate effectively." Park nodded calmly. "Signal the Prometheus Institute ships. Tell them it's time for the historical demonstration." "Ma'am." Rodriguez looked confused. "Lieutenant, are you familiar with the siege of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775? Park asked conversationally. "Not particularly, Admiral." "The American colonists captured a British fort and seized its artillery. Ordinary cannons weren't enough to break the siege of Boston, so they needed something special, something that could crack walls that conventional weapons couldn't touch." The dreadnoughts continued their advance, now only minutes away from optimal firing range. Their massive gravitational disruptors began charging, creating visible distortions in space around their weapon arrays. "Admiral," Rodriguez said urgently, "they're about to enter firing range. Should we begin evasive maneuvers?" "Not yet," Park replied calmly. "Signal the Institute ships to begin the demonstration. Full historical specifications." At the rear of the human fleet, 5 ships that had remained silent throughout the battle suddenly came to life. They were different from the sleek warships that had been engaging the hegemony fleet, larger and more angular, their hulls covered in what appeared to be massive gun barrels. "What are those vessels?" Admiral Vexhan demanded as his sensors detected the new ships powering up. "Unknown configuration, sir," his sensor operator replied nervously. "But they're drawing enormous amounts of power. Energy readings are off the scale." The Institute ships slowly rotated to present their broadsides to the advancing dreadnoughts. Along each flank, dozens of massive gun barrels emerged from concealed ports, each one nearly 100 meters long. They looked like ancient naval cannons scaled up to impossible proportions. "Siege artillery," Admiral Park explained to her bridge crew. "When you need to break something that conventional weapons can't touch, you go back to the principles that work. Mass velocity and really big guns." The first Institute ship fired. The projectile that emerged from its main gun was the size of a small shuttle and moved at velocities that made the earlier railgun rounds look slow. But this wasn't just a kinetic penetrator. As it streaked toward the lead dreadnought, sensors detected something that made Admiral Vexhan's blood freeze. "Sir, the projectile is showing fusion signatures," his tactical officer reported in a voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just a solid round. It's some kind of fusion-powered penetrator." The projectile struck the lead dreadnought's armor plating with the force of a small nuclear weapon. But instead of exploding on impact, it kept going. The fusion reaction that powered its core allowed it to burn through the exotic matter armor like a hot knife through butter, boring a tunnel straight through the massive ship from bow to stern. The dreadnought's death was spectacular. Internal explosions rippled along its length as the fusion penetrator destroyed critical systems. Secondary detonations followed as ammunition stores and fuel tanks went up in sympathetic explosions. Within seconds, the massive warship broke apart into glowing fragments. "Impossible," Vexhan breathed. "Nothing can penetrate dreadnought armor." Admiral Park's voice came over the communication channel, calm and educational. "Admiral, during the American Civil War, ironclad warships were considered invulnerable to conventional artillery. So military engineers developed armor-piercing shells with hardened cores and explosive charges. When armor gets better, ammunition gets smarter." The other Institute ships opened fire in sequence, each massive gun barrel launching fusion-powered penetrators at the remaining dreadnoughts. The results were uniform and devastating. One by one, the pride of the hegemony fleet died screaming into the void, their impenetrable armor proving worthless against weapons that combined ancient principles with modern technology. "All dreadnoughts destroyed," Rodriguez reported with barely concealed amazement. "Total engagement time, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Admiral Vexhan stared at his tactical display in complete shock. 12 of the most powerful warships ever built had been eliminated in less than 5 minutes by weapons that looked like something from a primitive naval museum. What are those guns?" he asked weakly. Admiral Park smiled. "We call them Dahlgren cannons after a 19th century naval artillery designer. The Institute thought it would be interesting to see what would happen if we scaled up his designs using fusion technology and exotic matter engineering." "This is madness," Vexhan protested. "You're using obsolete weapons." "No, Admiral," Park corrected gently. "We're using proven weapons. There's a difference. Kinetic energy doesn't become obsolete just because energy shields exist. You just need more kinetic energy." The surviving hegemony fleet began falling back in disorder, their formation completely broken. Hundreds of ships fled toward the edge of the system, abandoning any pretense of maintaining military discipline. The sight of the dreadnoughts being destroyed so easily had shattered their morale. "Sir, the fleet is in full retreat," Vexhan's tactical officer reported unnecessarily. "What are your orders?" Vexhan looked at the human fleet, which had barely taken any damage despite facing forces that outnumbered them more than 3 to 1. Admiral Park and her ships waited patiently, not pursuing the fleeing hegemony vessels, but making it clear they could destroy any ship that remained in the system. Open a channel to Admiral Park, he said quietly. The human admiral's face appeared on his screen again, her expression politely attentive. Yes, Admiral Vexhan. How, he asked simply. How did you develop such weapons? Our intelligence indicated that human technology was decades behind ours. Park considered the question carefully. Admiral, your intelligence was correct about our technology. Most of it is less advanced than yours. But you made one critical error in your assessment. What error? You assumed that advanced meant better, Park replied. Sometimes the old ways work just fine. You just need to apply them more enthusiastically. The Galactic Council emergency session convened 12 hours after the Battle of Kepler 442, as historians would later name it. Representatives from 47 species gathered in the massive chamber aboard the Council's primary station, their voices creating a cacophony of different languages and emotional states. Fear dominated the discussion. Ambassador Threllkix of the Crystalline Dominion spoke first, their voice resonating like breaking glass through the translation systems. The Hegemony First Fleet has been destroyed. 3,000 ships reduced to scrap metal by 800 human vessels. This changes everything. Murmurs of agreement and concern rippled through the assembly. The Hegemony had been the dominant military power in the galaxy for over a millennium. Their sudden defeat at human hands had shattered the established order overnight. How is this possible? Demanded Representative Quiloth of the Hive Collective, their insectoid mandibles clicking nervously. Human technology was assessed as primitive compared to hegemony standards. Their weapons were classified as obsolete kinetic systems. Ambassador Chen of the Terran Federation stood calmly at the human delegation's podium. She wore the same simple blue uniform that Captain Sarah Chen had worn during the diplomatic meeting. But her expression carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The galaxy was looking at humanity with new eyes, and not all of those eyes were friendly. Honored delegates, Chen began formally. The Terran Federation deeply regrets the loss of life in the Kepler system. We attempted to resolve this matter through diplomatic channels. Regrets? The Hegemony's emergency representative, General Morthak, rose from his seat with barely controlled fury. You slaughtered our finest fleet. Thousands of warriors died because you refused to abandon illegal settlements. General, Chen replied evenly. Those settlements were established according to Galactic Council colonization protocols. Your government chose to threaten civilian populations with military force. We simply defended our citizens. Defended? General Morthak's forearms gestured wildly. You used weapons of mass destruction. Those artillery pieces of yours violated every principle of civilized warfare. Ambassador Chen tilted her head slightly. General, I'm curious about your definition of civilized warfare. Are gravitational disruptors that tear ships apart at the molecular level more civilized than kinetic projectiles? Are temporal weapons that age crews to death in seconds more humane than fusion-powered penetrators? The chamber fell silent as delegates considered her words. The Hegemony's weapons were indeed terrifying in their exotic lethality, but they had been accepted as normal because they were advanced. This is sophistry, General Morthak snarled. Your weapons are primitive throwbacks to a barbaric age. Our weapons are effective, Chen corrected, which appears to be what matters in military conflicts. Elder Vasktul of the Ancient Watchers spoke up, their aged voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of galactic observation. Ambassador Chen, the Council requires explanation. How did your species develop such devastating kinetic weapons without any other civilization detecting the research? Chen smiled slightly. Elder Vasktul, we didn't hide our research. We published papers on advanced kinetic systems in open scientific journals for the past 30 years. The Prometheus Institute's work on historical weapons technology has been freely available to anyone interested in reading it. Impossible, protested the Zephyrian delegate. Our intelligence services monitor all technological developments. There were no indications of weapons research on this scale. That's because you weren't looking for weapons research, Chen explained patiently. You were looking for exotic technology development. Gravitational manipulators, quantum disruptors, temporal field generators. You overlooked kinetic research because you assumed it was obsolete. Admiral Vexhan, attending as a military observer, spoke up from the Hegemony section. But the energy requirements for your weapons should be impossible. The power needed to accelerate matter to those velocities is substantial, Chen agreed, but manageable when you're not trying to bend space-time or manipulate quantum fields. Our fusion reactors are actually quite simple compared to your gravitational power systems. We just use more of them. More of them? Elder Vasktol leaned forward with interest. Much more, Chen confirmed. Our larger warships carry 47 fusion reactors each. The Institute artillery ships have over 200. When you don't need power for exotic weapon systems or dimensional shields, you can dedicate everything to propulsion and kinetic acceleration. The implications slowly dawned on the assembled delegates. While other species had developed increasingly complex and energy-intensive weapons, humans had taken a different approach entirely. They had perfected simple systems and then built ships, specifically to power those systems to incredible levels. This is a violation of the natural order, declared High Priest Zendok of the Theological Union. Primitive weapons should not defeat advanced ones. It suggests that progress itself is meaningless. Respectfully, High Priest, Chen replied, I would suggest that effectiveness is the only measure that matters in warfare. Our weapons may be based on ancient principles, but their application is entirely modern. General Mordhak stood again, his scales flushed with anger. You speak of ancient principles? Your species has learned nothing from its violent past. You remain barbarians with better tools. Chen's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in her eyes. General, you might want to be careful about calling us barbarians. We've spent considerable time studying the hegemony's treatment of conquered populations. Glass houses and stones, as we say. What does that mean? Demanded Mordhak. It means that a species that practices orbital bombardment of civilian targets probably shouldn't lecture others about barbarism. Chen replied quietly. The chamber erupted in angry voices as various delegates began arguing among themselves. Some demanded that humanity be censured for developing such destructive weapons. Others pointed out that the hegemony had initiated hostilities. Still others worried about the implications for their own military doctrines. Elder Vasktol called for order with an amplified harmonic that silenced the chamber. The immediate question, they announced, is what this means for galactic stability. If human weapons can defeat hegemony fleets so decisively, where does that leave the rest of us? Ambassador Chen looked around the chamber at dozens of alien faces, seeing fear, anger, and calculation in equal measure. Honored delegates, the Terran Federation has no desire for conquest or expansion beyond our current territories. We simply want to live in peace and be left alone. But what if we don't leave you alone? Asked the Vorthak representative, their gaseous form flickering with nervous energy. What if other species decide that human expansion threatens their interests? Chen's smile was small and cold. Then I suppose they'll learn the same lesson the hegemony just learned. And what lesson is that? General Mordhak demanded. Chen looked directly at him, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. That sometimes the old ways work just fine. You just need to believe in them strongly enough. The silence that followed was deafening. Every delegate in the chamber was suddenly reconsidering their species' military doctrine, their diplomatic stance toward humanity, and their understanding of what constituted advanced warfare. The Terran Federation had just announced to the galaxy that they were not to be trifled with, and they had done it with weapons that any military museum would have been proud to display. 3 months after the Battle of Kepler 442, Professor Elena Vasquez stood before a packed auditorium at the Prometheus Institute on Earth. Representatives from every major galactic civilization sat in the audience, their various forms creating a bizarre but attentive gathering. The lecture hall buzzed with nervous energy as beings who had previously dismissed human technology as primitive now hung on every word. Welcome to today's presentation on historical weapons integration, Professor Vasquez began, her voice carrying clearly through the translation systems. I understand many of you have questions about our recent field demonstration. Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. In the front row, Admiral Vexhan sat rigidly upright, his reptilian features showing a mixture of professional curiosity and personal trauma. Beside him, Dr. Kelthera of the Hegemony Military Academy took detailed notes despite her species' recent humiliation. The fundamental question, Vasquez continued, advancing to the next slide showing ancient Earth cannons, is not whether old technology can compete with new technology. The question is whether we truly understand what makes technology effective. The slide changed to show a simple diagram of kinetic energy transfer. When our ancestors developed gunpowder weapons, they discovered a basic principle. Accelerated mass transfers energy upon impact. This principle has never changed, regardless of how sophisticated our delivery systems become. Dr. Kelthera raised one of her forehands. Professor, surely there are limits to kinetic effectiveness. Our gravitational disruptors manipulate space-time itself. How can simple projectiles compete with that level of sophistication? Vasquez smiled. Dr. Kelthera, you're thinking like an engineer instead of a physicist. Gravitational weapons are indeed sophisticated, but they're also energy-intensive and complex. Every component that can break will break, usually at the worst possible moment. Kinetic weapons are elegant in their simplicity, but the power requirements protested Ambassador Threlkix from the Crystalline Dominion. Our calculations suggest your railgun should require impossible amounts of energy. Only if you're also powering shields, gravitational manipulators, quantum computers, and dimensional drives, Vasquez replied. We made a different choice. Our ships are dedicated platforms optimized for specific purposes. A railgun destroyer doesn't need exotic defensive systems if it can avoid enemy fire entirely. The next slide showed technical specifications for a human destroyer. Its internal space dominated by massive capacitor banks and electromagnetic accelerators. Traditional starship design tries to balance multiple capabilities. We decided to specialize instead. Admiral Vexhan spoke up, his voice carefully controlled. Professor, our intelligence suggested that human ships were technologically inferior. How did we fail to detect vessels of this capability? Because you were looking for the wrong things, Vasquez explained patiently. Your sensors were calibrated to detect exotic energy signatures, quantum field fluctuations, gravitational anomalies. Our ships use simple fusion power and electromagnetic acceleration. By your standards, they barely registered as military vessels. She advanced to the next slide, showing a comparison between hegemony and human ship designs. Your ships are marvels of engineering capable of incredible feats. Our ships are tools designed for single purposes. It's the difference between a Swiss Army knife and a sniper rifle. But this approach seems so limited, observed Elder Vasktol through their harmonic translator. How can single-purpose vessels compete with multi-purpose warships? By being much better at their single purpose, Vasquez replied. A human railgun destroyer can accelerate projectiles to 98% of light speed, because every system is designed to support that goal. Your multi-purpose cruisers can do many things well, but they can't match specialized performance. The audience stirred uneasily as the implications became clear. Most galactic civilizations had followed similar technological paths, developing increasingly complex multi-purpose vessels with exotic weapons and defensive systems. Humanity had deliberately chosen a different direction. This explains the weapons, said Dr. Korath of the Technological Collective. But what about your ship performance? Your vessels demonstrated maneuverability that violates basic physics. Vasquez grinned. Actually, it violates basic assumptions about starship construction. Tell me, Dr. Korath, what's the primary structural limitation on high acceleration maneuvers? Crew survivability, Korath replied immediately. Organic beings cannot withstand extreme acceleration forces. Exactly, Vasquez confirmed. So we eliminated the limitation. The auditorium fell silent as delegates processed this statement. Finally, Ambassador Chen spoke from the human delegation section. Our ships use automated systems for high-acceleration combat maneuvers. Crews are placed in protective stasis during engagement sequences. Impossible, breathed Dr. Kelthera. The complexity of automated combat systems is significant, Vasquez agreed, but manageable when you're not trying to run exotic weapons and defensive systems simultaneously. Our combat computers are actually quite simple. They solve targeting solutions for kinetic weapons, not quantum field manipulations. Admiral Vexhan leaned forward. Are you saying your entire fleet was operated by computers during our engagement? Only during high acceleration sequences, Ambassador Chen clarified. Humans maintained strategic command, but tactical execution was automated. It allowed us to perform maneuvers that would have killed our crews. The implications staggered the assembled delegates. While they had developed increasingly sophisticated crew protection systems to allow high-performance combat, humans had simply removed crews from the equation during critical moments. This is a completely different approach to warfare, Elder Vasktol observed. You've sacrificed versatility for specialization, complexity for effectiveness. We've embraced the principles that work, Vasquez corrected. Kinetic energy, specialized systems, automation where appropriate. These aren't new concepts. They're foundational principles applied with modern technology. But why? Demanded General Mortak from the hegemony section. Why choose such limitations when more advanced options exist? Professor Vasquez looked directly at him. General, during your species expansion, how many ships have you lost to system failures? How many battles were decided by equipment malfunctions rather than tactical superiority? Mortak's silence was answer enough. Complex systems fail, Vasquez continued. Exotic technologies break down at critical moments. Simple systems, properly engineered, keep working when everything else falls apart. We didn't choose limitations, General. We chose reliability. The audience sat in contemplative silence as the full scope of human military philosophy became clear. While other species had pursued technological sophistication, humanity had pursued technological effectiveness. The results spoke for themselves. There will be a practical demonstration tomorrow, Vasquez announced as the lecture concluded. We'll be testing some of our other historical integration projects. I believe you'll find them educational. As the delegates filed out, discussing the implications in dozens of languages, Admiral Vexhan remained seated. He stared at the display showing human ship specifications, finally understanding how thoroughly his proud fleet had been outmatched. They hadn't lost to superior technology. They had lost to superior thinking, and somehow that was even more terrifying. 1 year later, the Galactic Council's annual Defense Summit took on a character unlike any in its 1,000-year history. The massive conference station orbiting the neutral world of Concordia hosted not just military leaders and diplomats, but also historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists. Everyone wanted to understand what had become known as the human approach to warfare. Admiral Lisa Park stood at the podium in the main assembly hall, facing an audience that now regarded her with a mixture of respect and wariness. Behind her, a holographic display showed galactic military statistics from the past year. The numbers told a story that had fundamentally altered the balance of power across known space. Honored delegates, Park began. It's been an interesting year. The understatement drew nervous laughter from the audience. In the 12 months since Kepler 442, 17 different species had begun retrofitting their fleets with kinetic weapon systems. The Crystalline Dominion had developed crystal matrix railguns. The Hive Collective had created swarm-launched penetrator rounds. Even the technologically advanced Theoretical Union had started experimenting with simplified weapon systems. Our technical exchange programs have been remarkably successful, Park continued. The Zephyrian Confederation's new kinetic destroyers are particularly impressive. The Vorthak Collective's gas-based acceleration systems show real innovation. The mechanical synthesis has developed some fascinating automated targeting solutions. Admiral Vexhan, now serving as the hegemony's liaison to the Human Military Exchange Program, raised one of his four hands. Admiral Park, the transformation in galactic military thinking has been unprecedented. But I must ask, was this your intention from the beginning? Park considered the question carefully. Admiral, our intention was simply to defend our colonies using the most effective means available. We never expected other species to adopt our methods so enthusiastically. But you must have anticipated the strategic implications, pressed Ambassador Threlkix. Once you demonstrated the effectiveness of kinetic weapons, it was inevitable that other civilizations would develop their own variants. True, Park acknowledged, though I confess we're somewhat surprised by the creativity different species have shown. The Aquatic Union's underwater railgun tests exceeded all our projections. The Silicon Collective's crystalline penetrators are frankly terrifying. Elder Vasketul spoke up, their harmonic voice carrying ancient authority. Admiral, the Watchers have observed warfare across the galaxy for 10 millennia. Never have we seen such rapid and comprehensive changes in military doctrine. You've triggered a revolution, have we? Park asked mildly. Or have we simply reminded everyone of principles they had forgotten? The question struck at the heart of what had become a galactic philosophical debate. Human military success hadn't been based on impossible technology or revolutionary discoveries. They had simply taken basic physical principles and applied them more thoroughly than anyone else had considered practical. Dr. Kelthera of the Hegemony Military Academy stood to address the assembly. The human approach has forced us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about warfare. We had become so focused on technological sophistication that we lost sight of tactical effectiveness. Dr. Kelthera, Park replied, sophistication has its place. Your gravitational disruptors are marvels of engineering, but sometimes the situation calls for a hammer instead of a precision instrument. Speaking of hammers, interrupted Captain Morrison of the Terran Marine Corps, perhaps it's time for today's demonstration? Park nodded and gestured toward the observation deck. Honored delegates, if you'll join us in the viewing area. The Prometheus Institute has prepared a presentation on their latest historical integration project. The assembled leaders moved to the massive transparent walls overlooking the test range, a cleared section of space several hundred kilometers from the station. In the distance, a decommissioned hegemony cruiser floated as a target, its weapons and drives disabled but its armor and shields intact. Professor Vasquez's voice came over the communication system from the Institute ship approaching the test zone. Today we're demonstrating a concept from ancient Earth naval warfare, the ship of the line. Rather than developing increasingly complex individual vessels, human naval forces sometimes concentrated firepower into coordinated formations. The test ship that emerged from hyperspace looked unlike anything in the galactic fleet registries. It wasn't a single vessel but rather a formation of connected modules, each one essentially a massive gun platform, linked to its neighbors by flexible connectors. The combined structure stretched over 10 kilometers in length. The HMS Constitution, Vasquez announced with obvious pride, is our attempt to answer a simple question. What would happen if we applied 18th century naval tactics to space combat? Admiral Vexhun stared at the impossible vessel through the observation deck. It's not a ship at all. It's a mobile artillery platform. Precisely, Park confirmed. When the situation calls for overwhelming firepower rather than maneuverability, why not build accordingly? The Constitution began its attack run on the target cruiser. Its hundreds of gun barrels tracked the distant target with mechanical precision, while the modular ship's fusion reactors fed power to electromagnetic accelerators that dwarfed anything previously constructed. Firing, Vasquez announced simply. The Constitution disappeared behind a wall of muzzle flash as every gun fired simultaneously. Hundreds of kinetic penetrators streaked across space at velocities that made earlier demonstrations look pedestrian. The decommissioned cruiser's shields flared briefly, then collapsed entirely. The ship itself lasted approximately 3 seconds before disintegrating into component atoms. The observation deck fell completely silent. How much firepower was that? Whispered Ambassador Chen. Approximately equal to a small stellar event, Professor Vasquez replied conversationally. We calculated that anything worth shooting with the Constitution probably deserved to be thoroughly shot. Elder Vascatol's harmonic voice carried a note of awe. The power requirements must be extraordinary. About the same as a hegemony dreadnought squadron, Park replied, but concentrated into a single devastating salvo instead of sustained combat operations. General Morthawk spoke slowly, his voice carrying new respect. Admiral Park, in all our military planning, we never considered anything like this. The tactical implications are staggering. General, Park replied. That's because you were thinking about ships instead of weapons. We designed a weapon that happens to be ship-sized. Ambassador Chen looked around the observation deck at faces that showed a mixture of admiration and fear. Admiral, with weapons like this, humanity could conquer the entire galaxy within a decade. Park's expression became serious. Ambassador, we could have conquered the galaxy a year ago if that had been our goal. The fact that we haven't should tell you something about our actual intentions. Which are, asked Elder Vascatal. The same as they've always been, Park replied simply. We want to be left alone to live in peace. But we also want everyone to understand that peace is our choice, not our limitation. The assembled delegates contemplated this statement as the Constitution began disassembling itself into component modules for transport. The demonstration was over, but its implications would resonate across the galaxy for generations. There is wisdom in the human approach, Elder Vascatal observed finally. Strength that chooses restraint is more valuable than weakness that has no choice. Admiral Vexhun nodded slowly. The hegemony learned this lesson the hard way. Perhaps others can learn it more peacefully. As the delegates began filing out of the observation deck, discussing the implications in dozens of languages, Admiral Park remained at the window. She watched the Constitution's modules flying away in different directions, each one capable of catastrophic destruction. but now returning to peaceful purposes. Captain Morrison joined her at the observation window. "Admiral, do you think this will actually lead to peace?" Park smiled slightly. "Captain, I think it will lead to very careful consideration before anyone decides to threaten human colonies again. Sometimes that's the best kind of peace you can achieve." In the distance, stars continued their ancient dance across the cosmos, unchanged by the small dramas of biological civilizations. But among those civilizations, a new understanding had taken root. The humans had whispered their message across the galaxy in the voice of kinetic thunder. This is from 1775, when we learned that sometimes the old ways work just fine, and the galaxy was listening.